All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today and for your interest in the 2023 Knauss Marine Policy Fellowship. My name is Madeline Roycroft and my pronouns are she, her. And I'm a program analyst for California Sea Grant based out of San Diego. And I will be the point of contact for the Knauss Fellowship this year. I'm also joined today by a few other California Sea Grant staff members. Nick, Carol, if you're around and can unmute yourselves and maybe do a quick intro, that would be great.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Sadrapor. I'm a program coordinator with California Sea Grant. I'm supporting Madeline for this round of Knauss Fellows, and I manage some of our other state fellowships and do some extension around coastal resilience. And I could see Carol, who's part of our fiscal team. I'm just promoting her to a panelist.
Great, thanks, Nick. All right, I see Carol. Carol, if you want to unmute yourself, do a quick intro.
Hi, good morning, all, or I guess it's afternoon. I am the proposal grants analyst at California Sea Grant, and I coordinate the submission of the Knauss Fellow applications to NOAA, which is through grants.gov. And then once our California cohort has been chosen, I work with those fellows throughout the term of their fellowship with their moving, relocation, travel, and stipend reimbursements. So looking forward to hearing from everyone, and thanks for being here.
Great, thanks, Carol. And I think with that, I'll go ahead and give a quick rundown for how today will go. So first of all, if you have any questions, we encourage you to use the Zoom Q&A feature, and we will monitor that throughout the webinar and either answer your question in the chat feature or live on the webinar. And then in case anyone has to hop off early or maybe wants to revisit some content that we talked about today, we will be recording this webinar and it will be posted on our website either later today or tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that and use that as a resource throughout this application process and in the future. All right, well, I'm definitely looking forward to getting to know some of you better, and thanks again for your interest in the fellowship. So with that, Nick, next slide. And I will just briefly go over what to expect in the next hour. So first, I'll provide a quick background on the National Sea Grant Program and California Sea Grant. And then I'll outline the expectations for the Knauss Fellowship. And I'll briefly cover eligibility, application tips, and evaluation criteria. And then I'll also run through what to expect in terms of a timeline for the next 12 months. And after that, I'll pause and take some time for some Q&A. And then after that, we will be joined by 3 Knauss alumni, and we'll have the rest of the webinar to ask them some questions about their experience as Knauss Fellows, and you will also have the opportunity to ask some questions as well. All right, next. All right, so some brief overview of the Sea Grant program. So Sea Grant was established through the National Sea Grant College and Program Act of 1966, which authorized the establishment and operation of the Sea Grant programs. And as you can see on the map, there are now 34 Sea Grant programs located in all of the coastal and Great Lakes states in the United States. And you will also maybe notice that we do have a couple of states like California that have multiple programs. So here in California, we actually have 2 programs, one of which is California Sea Grant, located in San Diego. And then we also have USC Sea Grant, which is located at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. And so, as you can imagine, we have all these programs scattered across the country, and each, as you would expect, might have different research areas, et cetera, but they sort of are all structured in the same idea of research, extension, education, workforce development, and communication. Next slide. So all of the work that California Sea Grant does falls under our strategic plan, which has 4 key focus areas: healthy coastal ecosystems, sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, resilient coastal communities and economies, and education, training, and public information. And essentially, these focus areas drive our required investment and the research, education, and outreach, et cetera, outlined in the previous slide. Next. So for more about what we, California Sea Grant, do, so in alignment with our strategic goals, California Sea Grant touches on a variety of areas. And first, as our name indicates, we provide grants and funding to the larger marine and coastal research community in California to meet our research mission. But maybe less known is that we also provide fellowships, mostly at the graduate and postgraduate level, to meet our education mission. And we also focus a lot of our work on outreach. So we also have a lot of programming and communication and extension as well. Next slide. So today we are talking about the Knauss Fellowship, which falls under our workforce development goal to increase research and education opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students. And this helps us achieve our goal to educate the next generation of marine and coastal scientists and policy leaders. Next. So as many of you have probably already read about online and hopefully heard about in the National Sea Grant informational webinars, the Sea Grant Knauss Fellowship provides a unique educational and professional experience to graduate students who have an interest in ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes resources, and in the national policy decisions affecting those resources. The program matches highly qualified graduate students with host offices in legislative and executive branches of government located in the Washington, D.C. area for a 1-year paid fellowship. Next slide. Since 1979, Sea Grant has brought over 1,400 fellows to work in the executive and legislative branches of government from 33 of the 34 Sea Grant programs across the country. And recently, the National Sea Grant Office released this data shown on the bottom right here, which may be helpful to some of you. It basically breaks down for the 2022 Knauss Fellows, the degrees that the finalists were seeking when they applied. So in 2022, there were 40 PhD, 29 masters, 2 JD, and 3 dual degree. And pictured on the left here is just a fun screen grab of the virtual orientation for the 2021 Knauss Fellows held by the National Sea Grant Office. And I just included this here to show you that, yes, the Knauss program is still moving forward even during COVID, and the fellows are still able to have a wonderful 12-month experience, whether virtual or in person. Next. The 2023 executive and legislative host list has not yet been released, and usually they are released quite late, so we don't have that to share with you today. However, as soon as it is available, we will post that on our website. So definitely keep monitoring the website for that information. But just to give you an idea, I've also put together a sampling here of some of the 2021 hosts. So for legislative hosts, some of those were the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, House Natural Resources Committee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, Senator Cory Booker, and the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation Science. And then for executive, I won't list all of these out, but there are quite a few, and some examples are NOAA NIMF's Ocean of Science and Technology, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Wildlife Refuge System, to name a few. So definitely keep monitoring our website, and we'll let you guys know as soon as that 2023 list is available. And also on our Knauss Fellowship page, we do have linked there all of the hosts, like the full list from 2021, if you want to see more examples. Next slide. So for applicant eligibility, any student, regardless of citizenship, is eligible to submit to this opportunity if the student is enrolled toward a degree in a graduate program, master's, PhD, or JD at any point between the onset of the fall 2021 term and our application deadline of February 18th, 2022. The graduate degree will be awarded through an accredited institution of higher education in the United States or US territories, and the student has an interest in ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes resources and in the national policy decisions affecting those resources. Next. So this fellowship is really an amazing opportunity for talented recent graduate students who have a focus on marine or aquatic related fields. And it would be a really good fit for someone who has an interest in making professional contributions to the office and are capable of working alongside state and federal partners and excited to learn about and help with the process of policy making and resource management. And I just wanted to highlight that the Knauss Fellows are definitely treated more than just students or interns. They really are treated like a member of staff during the fellowship and given a lot of experience and responsibility that comes with that. So, for example, you might have the opportunity to sit on a really important meetings or contribute to projects that you might not otherwise as a student or starting out right out of grad school have the opportunity to be a part of. So it's a really great opportunity to sort of wrap up graduate school and then directly transition into and see a taste of what employee life with the federal agency would look like. Next. All right, so now I'm just going to briefly cover the application requirements. And again, please reference all of the wonderful materials on the California Sea Grant website and the National Sea Grant website for more detail. But I just wanted to sort of outline what this looks like from a big picture. So first is your CV, which must be 2 pages. And if it is longer, which I know for many of you, it's really challenging to put all of your wonderful accomplishments in 2 pages. But if it is longer than that, we will have to remove any of the pages after those first 2 pages. And please, as a reminder, don't include any personal information or we will have to redact that information from your submission materials. The next is a personal education and career development response. So this year, this component is broken up into 3 sections where you essentially get to tell us a little bit more about yourself, your career path, and your life experiences. So we recommend that you don't just repeat your CV here and instead try to complement or expand on your CV and maybe provide some further details on why each experience makes you a good candidate for the Knauss Fellowship. We also encourage you to think beyond academics here. So talk more about your educational, professional, and personal life experiences that make you who you are today. And this specific component should not exceed 1,500 words total, including section headers. Next, we have relevant coursework and future plans. So this is an opportunity for you to talk about any kind of coursework, internship, or job opportunities that you have lined up in the near future. And if you don't have anything specifically set in stone, that's totally fine. It's appropriate for you to also talk about what opportunities you're looking into or interested in. So for example, you can explain how a class you have taken or something planned in the near future applies to or supports the Knauss program. And basically to summarize for that section, we're sort of looking for work-life experiences that are relevant to the Knauss Fellowship. And this section really gives you a chance to talk about what you have planned and fill any gaps in your timeline. And then next we have 2 letters of recommendation. These are 2 pages, single-spaced, and at least one of these has to come from a faculty member who has interacted with you in an academic or research setting. And I guess just a general tip is that we really recommend that you schedule a meeting with your letter writers and, discuss the fellowship opportunity, the selection criteria, and highlight your most relevant professional experiences for them during this meeting. And this really helps make the process easier for the letter writers, but it also can help strengthen your letters by being able to talk with them one-on-one about your experiences and career goals. And then last but not least, we require copies of your undergrad and graduate transcripts. And these can be unofficial copies. And essentially they are for reference only and will not be a part of your scored application package. Next. So one thing that we really value and will be looking for when reviewing your application is your application cohesion. So, we'll essentially look at your application as a whole. We're not necessarily just focusing on just the transcripts or just the CV. Every component of your application plays a really important role in the whole evaluation process. So please spend some time on each and every one of the components because they're all really important and they should complement each other and contribute to your application as a whole. Next slide. All right, so moving on to evaluation criteria. Again, this is just a general overview of the criteria. There's a lot more detail in the guidance documents that we've provided you, but so definitely please take a closer look at those when you're completing your application. So when we're going through your applications, we want to see goal statements that are specific, direct, and concise, and really talk about what you as an applicant would gain from this fellowship and also what you bring to the fellowship. And we don't expect you to try to predict the exact role or career that you have in the future, which can be really hard at this stage of your career, but we want you to basically what we're looking for is evidence that you've given thought as to why this experience is really important for you and how it will kind of launch you into the next stage of your career. And it's always great to see volunteer extracurricular activities such as mentoring, any maybe undergraduate students, or any type of volunteer work that you've done. So keep that in mind when you're completing your application. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to briefly cover now over the next few slides some tips for actually submitting your application. So California Sea Grant uses an online system called eSea Grant. I've included the link here for the login page. And here's a screen grab of what the registration page actually looks like. So if you have not registered already, you'll use that blue registration tab on the right to put in your information. And then once you've set up your account, you'll use the login tab to actually log in and start your application. And then I guess one thing I wanted to point out is if you, or I guess when you registered, we would recommend using an email address that you check regularly and that you won't lose access to for at least the next year or so. So that would be my pro tip for you guys when you log in. All right, next slide. So once you log in, you will see in your portal the option to add the 2023 Knauss Fellowship application. So click this blue button to activate the application. And once you click that button, it'll put it in your current tasks list, which is seen on like that left sidebar. And then next slide, please. So once you add the application or activate it, navigate to that sidebar and then click the blue text to begin or open the application. Next slide. So once you enter the actual application, you will see on the sidebar on the left all of the application components. So please, sooner rather than later, familiarize yourself with every one of these sections so that nothing catches you by surprise and you're really familiar with it and aren't having like technical stress issues once you're nearing that submission deadline. And then once you finish a section, be sure to click that mark as complete, that small little box that that arrow is pointing to, which will turn that red dot on the sidebar to green. And that essentially indicates that the section is complete for that portion of the application. And next slide. And then last but not least, once you finish all of the sections, so all of those red dots are now green, the very last thing you need to do is on the bottom left in the submission tab, you will go there and then make sure you click the submit button, which that orange arrow is highlighting. And once you submit your application, you will receive a confirmation email that your submission was successful. And you will also be notified that you can change or resubmit your application at any point prior to the submission deadline. And that's it for application tips. Next slide. All right, so now I'll just quickly run through the overall timeline for what to expect over the next 12 months. So the application is due by February 18th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. And then after that period, myself and Nick and some alumni will go through all of your applications, and then we'll select a subset of applications that we will interview on Zoom. And then February to March, we will interview those people. And then at the end of that period, we will select up to 6 finalists, and we will send those 6 applications on to the national review process. Typically, we hear back from the national review stage in early summer as to which of the finalists have been selected for the fellowship. And then in fall 2022, with the disclaimer that these dates are subject to change, that's actually when placement week would happen. And then last but not least, February 1st, 2023 would be the fellowship start date. All right, I think moving on to the next slide, we will pause now for questions. Let me pull up the Q&A.
Yeah, we've answered some questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to reference them.
Sure, let's see. So we have one question come in regarding letters of rec. So is it recommended to have 2 letter writers from our academic experience, or 1 professional and 1 academic? And so let's see. Ideally, the 2 letters would have worked with the student, including at least 1 from a faculty member with the knowledge of the student's academic and research performance. So yeah, so at least 1 is the recommendation, 1 academic. And what else? We have a question come in: how many applications from California go to the national level usually will be selected as a finalist? So of those 6 that we send to the national level, I think the question is how many of those would end up being selected? Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Carol or Nick, if you have.
Yeah, it depends. Some years it could be all 6. Some years there's no guarantee on any.
All right, we have another question come in. It seems like many of the finalists come from UCSD Scripps or USC. Is there a significant disadvantage if you apply from a school other than those 2? And the answer is definitely not a disadvantage. Ultimately, you are evaluated for your application materials, your experience level, your academic background, etc. So you are strictly evaluated on those experiences and not necessarily the school that you came from. if anyone else on my team has any additions to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I would say the experience that you're looking for highlighted in your personal and career statement, as well as your overall CV, matter much more than just a specific school that you attended for graduate school.
Any other questions? A reminder to please use the Q&A feature. And you will also have time at the end after our alumni panel to ask more questions. So keep them coming. And if I don't see any more come through, oh, here we go. In your application, I'll answer this slide, sorry. So in your application, do you specify a preference for placement in the executive or legislative branch? I'm under the impression that you do not. But Nick or Carol, please correct me if that is not true.
I believe you designate that later in the process, once you become a national finalist.
Great.
I can answer this question, Madeline.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, the question is in regards to the director's letter, is that a portion of the application that this letter is going to be written and signed by Sea Grant interviewers in February, March? That's correct. The director letter is the director of the Sea Grant program that you're applying through. So that would be our director of California Sea Grant, Dr. Shauna O. And so after we do the interviews of a subset of applicants internally to California Sea Grant, we will select the finalists that we're nominating to the national competition. And the director letter will be coming from our program, from our director, along with those applications we're sending to the final, the national finalists.
Great, thanks, Nick. All right, I think I'm going to move on to the alumni panel, but please keep the questions coming. We'll answer them over the next 30 minutes. So Nick, if you could promote our panelists, and then I'm going to change the participant view. Let's see. All right, let's see, attendee view gallery. All right, welcome panelists. Kat, Tori, do we have Noah on here? Yes, great. All right, so, and I'm gonna turn off my camera so that they can highlight your wonderful faces. Great. Well, welcome to our 3 Knauss alumni, Tori, Noah, and Kat, who are here to talk to you today about their experiences as Knauss Fellows and answer any questions that you may have for them. So first, I'll just start with introductions. So maybe I'll start with Tori. If you could go ahead and introduce yourself, give us your fellowship year, host, and current role. And if you're comfortable, maybe talk about like your program that you were in just prior to the fellowship as well.
Thanks, Madeline. Hi, everyone. My name is Tori Bahi. I use she, her pronouns. My fellowship year was in 2017, which now feels like a lifetime ago. I worked with Representative Jimmy Panetta, who's a Democrat from California and represents the Monterey, Big Sur, Santa Cruz area. And currently I am in Seattle, Washington, working as an associate, kind of a environmental consultant and project manager at Roche Strategic. And prior to the fellowship, I had done a lot of work on community conservation in more of the marine space. Unfortunately, not doing as much marine work right now, but excited to answer your questions and also excited to see Noah, who is part of my cohort. So good to see you, Noah.
Great, I'll just kick it off to Noah then.
Yeah, hi Tori. It was a surprise, but glad to see you. Glad to see you on at least on screen. Yeah, so my name's Noah Benederet. I also did my fellowship in 2017 and also was a legislative fellow. So I think you guys are getting quite the legislative slate here. I worked with Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, who's still in the Senate. Did a lot of stuff on sort of Pacific Northwest fisheries, a lot of salmon and steelhead work, kind of bounced all over the place. And prior to the fellowship, I did a PhD at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I studied yellowtail and other sort of recreationally targeted fishes in the Southern California Bight. So a lot of field work, a lot of time riding fishing boats, and it was a huge and very interesting shift to go to an office in DC.
Great, thanks, Noah. And last but not least, Kat.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kat Montgomery. I use she, her pronouns. I was a 2020 legislative fellow, so crazy year for all of us. And I was in the office of Senator Roger Wicker. He's a Republican from Mississippi. And at the time, he was the chairman of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. So I got to do Gulf work. I also got to interact a lot with the committee and the committee staff, which was an interesting sort of dual experience. Prior to my fellowship, I did the Master of Advanced Studies in Marine Biodiversity and Conservation program at Scripps, where I focused on aquaculture and fisheries policy. And prior to that, I actually worked in environmental education for youth. So I sort of did this pivot. I came to grad school and pivoted to policy and then used the Knauss Fellowship to sort of help propel me in that direction.
Great.
Oh, and we're saying what we're doing now, yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I work at a small bipartisan lobbying firm. We provide government affairs and policy strategy for like ocean-based nonprofits and companies based in DC.
Great, thanks, Kat. So I'm just going to kick us off with a question to get us going. So there are many paths we can take while we are wrapping up or after we finish a graduate program. So how did you know that the Knauss Fellowship was the one for you, or what ultimately led you to decide to apply to or accept the fellowship? And I will start with maybe Noah, if he doesn't mind.
Sure, yeah. Oh, I guess since I forgot to mention before, so I'm currently at the California Ocean Protection Council as their Sustainable Fisheries and Aquaculture Program Manager. So we're a really small state agency that does like program development. So sorry for forgetting that before, but I've been doing fieldwork for a long time. Like I had a master's before my PhD, and policy was not something that I thought I was going to go into. It was really the experiences during my PhD work of spending a lot of time with like the fishing community and the general public, and having to be sort of a face for science. And it happened to just coincide with right after the South Coast MPAs were implemented in 2012, and got a lot of sort of heat from people because I was the only person riding these boats and collecting samples. And it was a really interesting and eye-opening experience of sort of seeing how management and policy affects kind of your day-to-day resource user. And it forced me to think long and hard about what I wanted to do in science, and realize that at an impact level, if I really cared about conservation and like marine resources, the way you kind of achieve sort of better conservation is through better policy. And that sort of forced me to think about stuff. And I also just wanted to get out of San Diego, and working in DC kind of seemed very cool. And then Congress sort of added an extra level of like, wow, this is a system I know nothing about. And this seems to be the absolute best program to sort of get my feet wet and understand sort of the basics of how things are happening on the national level. I think that was addressed most of the question.
Yeah.
Let me know if I forgot anything.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I'll bounce it now to Tori. So, what ultimately led you to decide to apply to or accept the Knauss Fellowship?
Yeah, in college I had a mentor, and he had actually done this program a couple of years before I did, and we had one of those heart to hearts where I'm like, I don't know what I want to do. Like, there's just so many things out there, and he mentioned this fellowship and how you take government classes. At the time, I was taking this California coastal policy class, and a lot of the concepts they were talking about were just they blew my mind. And he's like, if you want to learn more about it and try to build those connections, this fellowship might be a great opportunity for you. So I, did some Googling, did some searching, and I'm like, oh, this is a longstanding thing. And you just get that really hands-on experience. So for me, having done, some science, not as much as Noah and some other of my cohort, but having kind of done a lot of different environmental studies, and for me, it felt like the next thing was policy. And I'm like, well, I don't really have anything to lose, so let's try this new adventure. And I've also never lived on the East Coast, and why not try to insert myself in this new space and learn as much as I can? And that was kind of my mentality going into it, of just like, I'm just a sponge. Let me soak up everything and learn about these things. So then if I do or don't decide to stay in the policy world, when I hear things and people talking about it, and in my work right now, I can be like, oh, well, there's like 10 other steps between what you want versus like, what's actually going to happen. So I think that's just really nice to kind of know what's going on in the background. But yeah, it was a leap of faith for me, and I'm very excited to have gone through that, because it's one of those experiences that you really can't replicate. I think if you live on the East Coast and are close to DC and can do those internships, you might get a taste of that. But honestly, that year, looking back at that year, I'm like, oh wow, this was something that's totally different, and very happy to have done that.
Great. Thanks, Tori. What about you, Kat?
So I had sort of my eye on policy already when I came to graduate school, which was in 2018. That was a big year for politics, which is sometimes tied to policy, not always. And I found myself really interested in like how the will of the federal government, affects the oceans and coastal communities. And it just was something that I was interested in exploring. And then my grad program started out with a lot of different opportunities to, meet different folks who are in a lot of different jobs. And I started to see this trend that a lot of people who I found really interesting and had really interesting jobs and great perspectives had done the Knauss Fellowship, one of which was Noah, actually. And so, I met all these people and I was like, wow, this is so interesting. All these people did this same fellowship that I've never heard of. And they all like understand, the policy implications and all of these things that I wanted to understand. So that was how I first found out about it. And sort of from that point on, it became my goal to do it. And it also frankly aligned for me because I'm originally from the DC area and I had been out in California for like almost 10 years. And I was looking to sort of make a shift back east. So I know that won't be everyone's experience, but for me, it was like really the perfect, just like storm of all these different things. And then I also would echo what Tori's saying of like I had so many people say, this is a once in a lifetime sort of thing, of course you can go to DC and you can find a job, and it's not like if you don't get this, it's off the table. But just this like pipeline directly from graduate school into policy is a really unique opportunity, and one that I wanted to at least, go for.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So now let's talk about what the average day was like, which I know can be a really hard question to answer with such a dynamic fellowship position. But if anyone maybe just wants to jump in and say what their average day or week looked like to help everyone paint a picture in their heads, that would be great.
I think it's an interesting question because it's like, I have been thinking about, we have Sea Grant Fellows now at OPC on the state side, and how that experience has shifted because of the pandemic. So take everything, I guess, that like, Kat, you're probably the best to answer this, like, first off, but like take everything I'm going to say with like a large caveat of like, I'm not sure how a lot of the congressional offices are doing meetings and stuff now, but it was show up, you work as a legislative fellow, you sort of work a longer day than the rest of the exec fellows, which means happy hours you're always late to if anyone happens to still be there. But it was very cool. So you show up, you sort of work through, we'd have a legislative staff meeting at the beginning of the week, sort of plan out what you're working on. I then sort of, as like a oceans person, we had a natural resources team in our office who I worked with another legislative assistant and then our like natural resources council, and we were like directly under the chief of staff. And so we took meetings from lobbyists and constituents. We sort of worked on state and federal policy issues. Happened to start a week after Trump's inauguration, so it was by and large lots of nominations because it was in the Senate. So it was a lot of sort of background research and fights and sort of really interesting sort of nitty gritty Senate stuff. But it was every week was different, but there was continuity in that you were always sort of public facing, you were meeting with constituents, you were doing a lot of background research, writing kind of staff recommendations or memos. So the senator would be going into a meeting the next day and needed to know, we've worked with some commercial fisheries lobbying group, and they were pushing a certain issue. So you would have a half page to get them up to speed. You'd give them a couple talking points, and then make sure that he was ready to go for this meeting. And you would sort of be the technical expert to answer a lot of questions. That's sort of what I think a lot of my work was, that and then lots of background research as well. But now I'm talking to friends that still are out there, like no one's really taking in-person meetings. So who knows, that was a huge chunk of like my work life that probably doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I started beginning of February 2020, and then I had like maybe 5 or 6 weeks in the office before everything shut down. And an interesting side note is like a lot of offices just weren't prepared. Most were not prepared at all for that. Like we didn't have laptops. I didn't even have a phone. It was just like, so it really was this huge like shift that had to happen. That's not really related to this, but it's kind of interesting. So we stopped taking in-person meetings for a while. We actually went back in person. It's interesting now because some offices are in person and some aren't, and some are taking meetings and some aren't. For the most part, most people aren't taking in-person meetings because now I'm the one asking for the meetings. But a lot of virtual meetings now. So it's actually like you can take even more meetings because you can just be back to back to back on Zoom. So I'll echo what Noah said about like lots and lots of meetings. Meetings are typically 30 minutes on the Hill, so you can like stack a lot of them into a day. And then the other thing that I sort of had going on was you have your like day-to-day, like this thing is on fire, you have to, work on this right now. There's a lot of fast-paced work on the Hill. But then there's also, you typically have these projects that are sort of like your back burner projects. And then when things aren't going crazy or when there's not something happening that's like, really active, then that's when you would turn to your other projects. So like I had a piece of legislation that we were working on that was sort of like our thing that we would go to whenever we could. And then there's fluctuation between, at least if you're on the Hill, if you're in session, if the member is actually in the office, then that's when you have a lot of like, memos that you're getting ready and you're pitching. We had a legislative time each week where we would all get together and like pitch memos to the senator. And then when you're in recess, that's an opportunity to do more of that like deep work usually, or take meetings that aren't quite as, mission critical. You have meet and greets and things like that. So there's sort of this like cyclical, when everybody's there, everything is quite busy. And then when they leave, it calms down a little bit usually.
Yeah, definitely want to echo Kat's sentiment of it can get really crazy. For me, I was in the House, so there was maybe 8 of us total in the office. So I was working on all natural resources, water, land, freshwater, saltwater. So it's definitely, for me, if you're interested in the house, it's definitely, you're kind of like a one-person team, and you kind of communicate with your other staff, kind of the higher level staff, in terms of how to approach certain subjects, like what's the best way in terms of like getting in front of the member and things like that. Also would like to say that, when you're out of session, when you're kind of on recess and things slow down, what I actually did is I took a lot of courses through the Congressional Research Service to learn more about the legislative process. I have this like 3-inch binder that I've kept all these years that kind of just dissects everything. And also, like Noah said, you don't really get to attend a lot of happy hours, and a lot of them are in Silver Spring, and you're like, I do not want to take the metro all the way up there. But one thing that I did is I went with all of the interns and learned how to give Capitol tours. So on Friday afternoons, when the member was on his flight back to California, I would message all the executive fellows and be like, hey, I can take up to 5 people if you want a Capitol tour. If you do, message me, meet in the office, and I'll take you on a tour. So that was, if you are nervous about, well, there's so many people, how do I get to know people? That was one way that I did it. And, it's super cool because you have a badge, so you can like walk wherever you want to go and you don't need to get escorted in. So I think, this is also like a great professional development opportunity, but it's also just like amazing personal opportunity. So I tried to take those in moments, because it can be very stressful to really just think about, wow, this is super cool that I'm in this building and like being part of history in a sense. But in terms of day to day, I think both Kat and Noah kind of echoed, you get a lot of meetings, you talk with a lot of people, you accumulate a lot of business cards, which now may not be the sense right now, but you just meet a lot of people working on a lot of incredible things. And it's kind of interesting being in that position where you're kind of like the gatekeeper, where you're kind of like, oh, this is something, my boss could be really interested in. So I'm going to kind of like open the gate for them and let them know this is happening. Or you could be like, maybe we'll wait just a little bit. Maybe there's an opportunity, a couple months from now. So I think that's just also like a really, really amazing thing to experience, and something that I wasn't anticipating, but just kind of reflecting on that made me, shocked me a little bit.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I love hearing all the similarities and differences and all of your experiences. I guess I'm curious to hear, maybe what was something you least expected or surprised you about the fellowship? Anyone? Or most rewarding, if that's too hard to answer.
I think for the least, I was surprised at the amount of access that I had, and like how much I like was deferred to as like a subject matter expert. Like feel like you go through grad school, like especially a PhD, and you just are like constantly sort of like told that like, oh, this isn't good enough, and oh, that's wrong, and you need to fix this, and that analysis is like pretty poor, and you should really redo this, and have you read this paper? And you sort of show up there, and it was really like reaffirming for kind of the work that I had already put in like in academics, and to show up and be like, oh, you have a PhD in like fisheries science, like you're now gonna like take the lead. And you're like, whoa, like wait a second, like I'm not supposed to be doing any of this. And they're like, no, you know more than anybody here, so here you go. And like that was kind of mind-blowing, and also like very cool. It was like sort of a nice like cap to like a very long like PhD process, to like get that affirmation of like, oh, you put in a ton of work and you actually know your stuff. And I think like everyone who gets the fellowship is probably in that position where you've done an enormous amount of work that like may or may not be like have as much, carry as much weight in the circles, in the academic circles that you're already in. But you see that once you're out, that like, especially when it comes to like questions of, rulemaking or policy, or, whatever, name your conservation issue, like people are sort of know that you're bringing something to the table as a fellow. That was unexpected, but also very cool.
Sorry, Kat, I know we were doing the mute unmute dance there. I think one thing that kind of was surprising is that in the offices, I think it depends on each office, but a lot of people had um, degrees in things that they weren't actually in charge of, which is not saying it's a bad thing, but it's one of those things that I was just like, oh, like, I mean, well, one of my coworkers, he studied agriculture, and he was in charge of ag, so that worked out really well. But there were, some other people that worked on other issues that they were like, oh yeah, I just kind of learn on the go. And I'm like, wait, what? But I think that was one thing I was really scared of. But I think the biggest thing is if you're able to learn quickly and kind of like to put pieces together, get to know people, I think that's really valuable. When I was there, they were talking about like national monuments and Bears Ears, and I'm like, I've been to these places, I don't know anything about them. So having to do a lot of that background research, but it'd be crazy. People calling, they're like, are you the natural resources for Congressional District 20? And I'm like, I guess I am. So kind of that amount of responsibility put on you is quite shocking at first, but it's also like really cool at the same time. But just learning on the fly is like a really big thing. And yeah, people are like, you're the expert. I'm like, I am far from being an expert, but thank you. And I'll take it and kind of run with that confidence.
Yeah, I think the thing that popped into my mind is kind of tied to what both of you have said, which is that like I was shocked to learn how much of the federal government operates on the shoulders of people in their like 20s and 30s. I mean, it's just like it's truly wild. And once you realize that like there's all these people who are just making it happen, like based on like grit and just like knowing how to research and knowing how to do stuff is really incredible. And it is like a confidence booster. I think for me it was when I first came in and thinking like, oh my gosh, everyone's going to know so much more than me, like I'm not going to know what to do. And then you kind of look around and you're like, everybody is just kind of making it happen. And not to say that there aren't people who are incredibly knowledgeable and talented, but it just was it was a real surprise. A lot of the real work that is done in Congress especially is like done by people who are a few years out of undergrad or out of grad school and who are just making it happen. And it was really incredible. And then the one other thing I was going to say that surprised me is in my office, and I think in any personal office, you end up working on appropriations, which is like the process of, of Congress funding the agencies and funding the federal government. And I knew it was important, but I just didn't feel that it was something I'd be interested in. I had my eye on like ocean bills and things like that. And I just, I found it really interesting and kind of fun to go through that process. It's a lot of work, but it's also something that like Congress does every year or should do every year. And so they work on it like all the time. And it's a big role of what Congress does. And I just, I think I didn't realize that. And so I took away a lot of it opened my eyes to like the process of asking for those funds and allocating those funds and all of that is really important.
And sorry, just to piggyback off Kat, also the surprising thing, I didn't know what appropriations was when I started this fellowship. Again, I was a very dry sponge, literally knew nothing. And one crazy thing is that, they're like, oh, your boss is going to testify, and you have to like help write their speech and like funding amounts. And they're like, does this funding amount look good? And you're like, yes. And it's like millions of dollars. So that's like one thing that you're like, oh, wow. Obviously you communicate with other offices and do that. But it was just shocking to know that I had a part in that, hopefully for the better. But yeah, that was like another very surprising thing that I encountered in the spring.
Great. Thank you guys for those answers. So we do have a question from an attendee. So they're asking, how much input do you have as a fellow over your host pairing? For example, working in legislative or executive or over your specific host?
I can go.
Okay. So to the first question of legislative versus executive, this changes often. The Knauss process is always evolving, I've learned. But the way it was for me, and I think the way it was last year, is once you are selected as a fellow, then, maybe like a month later, or as a finalist. So once you're selected and you know that you're going to go through the process, you are able to submit like a paragraph of your preference, either legislative or executive, and then the national office takes a look at all of those preferences and sort of like matches them up with your resume and your background, and then sorts people accordingly. So I think that's still how they're doing it. So you put in your preference, but ultimately they do the sorting. And then to the second question of your host office, the placement process is complex and kind of crazy, but basically you interview with offices and then they interview you, and then you both sort of rank each other. And so there's this process of you put in your preferences and they put in their preferences, and then through like an algorithm that is sorted out as well. So I think the answer to both is you have some input, but you ultimately are also dealing with input from the offices and then input like from the national office, the National Sea Grant Office. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I think that's pretty good, because I know it's definitely switched since Tori and I did it, because it was a little less smooth and a little more kind of, I don't know, organic, for lack of a better word. It was because I applied as no preference, and I was assigned to be a legislative fellow based on like my interests in my application, and we had like a physical match, so there was no algorithm. It's just sort of, they posted the agency's top like 5 or 6 on a board, and you had yours, and everyone sort of went around the room and like horse traded, and it was an interesting experience, and that caused some stress. And it sounds like they've reformed that. Okay, so you did.
I think they changed it the year after. Yeah, for the last cohort, I hear they changed it.
Yeah, it was an interesting day, but I think it sort of works out. And someone, I forget who told us this, like from National Sea Grant, that like even if like just if you don't get your first choice, like be okay with it, because odds are like things like work out. And I was really kind of cynical and skeptical about that, and it really was true. Like I got my third, like my office was technically my third choice, but and it ended up being like a really good fit for me and my my personality and how I work. And I think had I actually ended up in my first choice office, I would have struggled more just talking with the fellow who did get that and the stuff that she had dealt with. And it was really interesting. Like, I think that there is this nature of the match where like it sort of works out. And I guess it's also just a reminder that like personal relationships are super important. Like you might like the name or the position of any office, whether it's exec or ledge, but that at the end of the day, it's like you're spending an enormous amount of time in this certain office culture with these people. And I think paying attention to that relationship is more important than like the area of work that a ledge or exec office does. At least that's how I sort of looked at it, and it was helpful.
All right, so we have like 30 seconds left. There is one more question, so let's just get to it real quick. Are you able to meet or network with other politicians that you are not hosted with? Just a quick 20-second response to that. Anyone?
I think it depends. Yeah, I think it depends. They're also super busy too. So I think a lot of times if I went to go visit another fellow, they'd be like, oh, here's my boss. And you're like, hi, nice to meet you. But that was just for me.
Yeah, everything goes through staff. So it's the staffers that do the brunt of the work. You imagine like the member is like the name of the company, and like the company does this, but it's the staff underneath them. And that you do have, as a fellow, you do have a ton of access to, where you can go talk to another staffer, you can go meet with them, and stuff will filter up to the member, whether if it's important enough or if it's something they have personal interest in, like Tori was saying. But yeah, there's a ton of opportunity for networking, maybe less so with like Bernie Sanders, but with his staffers. So
Great. Thank you guys. Well, we are out of time, but thank you so much to our alumni for being here and taking time out of your day. It's just so great to hear your perspective. And for those of you that are still on the call, thank you again for attending the webinar. We hope that it was helpful to you. And we will post this on the website, so you're welcome to watch it anytime. And also, we do encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. Nick, if you haven't already, maybe you could link the newsletter link for everyone. And so that's just a good way to stay in tune and connected with the Sea Grant Network and hear about all of California Sea Grants things that are going on in our program. So with that, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And again, reach out to sgproposal@ucsd.edu for any questions about the fellowship. And if you do want me to maybe connect you with some other alumni, just reach out to that email and maybe I could forward your questions to them. So thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.